welcome, Mike, to our webinar. Really exciting to have you with us again, especially with this topic that is fascinating. As you can see, there is a lot of enthusiasm for this conversation with you. And well, I'm pretty sure that you don't need a presentation. So please, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Angela. It's good to be back at Meta Forum. We've got an hour and a half, which a good conversation. And please feel free to interrupt with questions at any point. As we go through the presentation, you'll find that it divides into 6 or 7 elements, and if there are any questions at any point, we can take them then, make it more interesting. So it's a talk on the relationship between the work of Alexander Bogdanov and Stafford Beer, and in particular the relevance of that for a potential post-capitalist future. Now they were of course very different characters. Let me talk a little bit about Bogdanov. His dates are there. You'll see it spans the event, the 1917 revolution in Russia. Bogdanov was trained in medicine, but he became very much of a polymath, a philosopher and a social theorist. He was a Marxist first and foremost, but a particular type of Marxist, in that he didn't think that Marx had set out the truth for all time. He was what you might call a critical Marxist. He believed that the idea had to be constantly updated, given the findings of modern science and given new work in philosophy. And he was particularly influenced by a philosopher called Ernst Mach, who, fair to say, attributed a greater role to ideas in social development than was the case with more traditional Marxists such as Plekhanov and Lenin. And his major work, of course, was Techtology, a volume that came out first in 3 parts, and a universal science of organization, it's called. It was very influential. He was at an early stage equally important in the Bolshevik Party as Lenin, but later in his career fell out with Lenin, and Lenin helped to sideline him in the Bolshevik Party, and Stalin wrote him out of history entirely. Nevertheless, a very influential figure and very important work he did. And many people think that his work on techtology provides a better foundation for systems thinking than, for example, von Bertalanffy's work in general system theory. Stafford Beer, I guess, needs no introduction at all to this group, which is founded to protect his legacy and to advance his legacy. Of course, he was a British management scientist, an operational researcher, worked in industry, founded organizational cybernetics, which he saw as a science for effective organization. A huge body of important work, but his best known project was the one for Salvador Allende, president of Chile, that was put to an end by the Pinochet coup d'etat. So I'm going to talk about what they had. There's no evidence that other people may know differently, but I can find no evidence that Stafford ever read Bogdanov's work, which to me makes the correspondences between what they have to say even more remarkable. So we'll be looking at those correspondences and then at their relevance to a potential post-capitalist future. And the thing's not changing. Right. Aha. Just bang it harder. That's the way with technology. So here's some similarities perhaps in the underlying philosophies. As I say, Bogdanov was a Marxist, but a critical Marxist, much influenced by Mach. So he didn't believe in truth for all time. He believed that truth was something that was relevant and useful for people during a particular historical epoch. And that put him very much at war with Lenin, who believed that Marxism had immutable truths that were true for all time and couldn't therefore be surpassed. So he was, as is a critical Marxist, taking notice of new advances in science and philosophy, and his form of Marxism is more of a type with the early Marx and with later Marxists such as Gramsci, Lukács, and the Frankfurt School than it was with the sort of hardline Soviet Marxism of Lenin and Stalin. He felt that people could, the concept of alienation was important for him. He thought that people could have satisfying work in the jobs that they did, and at the same time contribute to society, so that they were fully engaged in contributing to society. So a critical Marxist, more in tune with Marx's early ideas perhaps than with his Marx's later ideas or Engels' ideas, or certainly the Marxism of Plekhanov and of Lenin. Stafford Beer, although he worked for a Allende government, wasn't, of course, a Marxist. But he very much embraced, and you can find this in many of his books, Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, which is about people realizing their potential, getting satisfaction from life, flourishing, realizing their potential through virtuous activity, for the activity that they were engaged in, not having to do something else like make money in order to fulfill what they actually wanted to do. It's a concept of human flourishing, realization of potential. Of course, for that to be the case, then there has to be some, if you like, positive freedom. Everybody has to have a reasonable standard of living. So there's an element of social critique in that, which brings many of the conclusions that Stafford Beer reached about the kind of society he might want to see become quite close to those of Bogdanov, working from a different Marxist perspective. And certainly Beer as well, of course, wanted everybody to have control over their working environments and at the same time have significant influence, if you like, at the System 5 level. And in Chile created devices, sought to create devices where that could actually occur. So the concept of eudaimonia attracted Beer to the potential that he could offer in Chile, and particularly to Allende's concept of a decentralized, worker participative, anti-bureaucratic form of society. So very different starting points, Marx and Aristotle, but the conclusions they come to not that different. There's another philosophical comparator, in that they, in my view, both shared a pragmatist orientation. As I say, for Bogdanov, there were no immutable truths. They developed and changed historically. And what was truth was what proved useful for people in a particular epoch. So truth was the kind of tool that helped you engage with nature or with society in a successful way, a pragmatist orientation. And that came from Ernst Mach, who also influenced William James, the American philosopher, pragmatist philosopher. It may appear odd to refer to Stafford Beer as a pragmatist when he's searching for the laws of ability. But if you take Pickering's reading of the early days of British cybernetics through Walter and Ashby, and read Stafford Beer's work in that way, and I find that reading particularly attractive, then you get close to saying that it was very pragmatist orientation. And Pickering's view is that it comes close to the philosophy of William James as well. So Ashby's notion that of the embodied mind, which is not seeking absolute truth, it's seeking an ability to get by in the world, and truth is a performance. You can bring truth about through performance. It's like establishing in Beer's terms a system as viable, but letting it co-evolve with its environment, where it explores the potential available to it, not predictable in any way in advance how actually it would develop. So some real similarities in where they get to with Marxism and eudaimonia, and a shared pragmatist orientation as well, which I'll note again later when I come to some other similarities. I don't know whether anybody wants to come in with any queries at that point, because it's quite a lot of ground covered there, and you may or may not agree. Sounds like they all agree, Angela, which is satisfying, I think. Here's the second point of comparison, the role of science. Bogdanov is clear that the success of a revolution depends as much upon a social revolution, a technological revolution, as upon a social revolution. And he was very critical of the science of his day. He thought it was useless to the proletariat, effectively. It was too complex and it was too fragmented. And in a sense, it was his lifetime endeavor to make science available to the proletariat. He saw science of his time as being the weapon of the enemy, of the bourgeoisie. And technology was his big attempt to simplify science and to bring it together in this science of universal organization, such that it could become useful and usable by the proletariat, so that they themselves could become world builders, as he put it. He wanted them to have the capacity to be world builders, and technology meant, in his terms, it provided them with the ability to be world builders. And once you'd simplified science and made it available to the proletariat in a general form which they could understand, then they could essentially do away with the intelligentsia. I mean, talking about the Soviet Union, I have to be careful when I say do away. They could bypass the intelligentsia, who were, in Bogdanov's views, unreliable, would not necessarily be committed to the revolution. Particularly in Designing Freedom, Stafford Beer has some very strong things to say about science, which in his view had to stop being oppressive and alienating. It had to be wrenched back, and he uses that term, it had to be wrenched back from those who currently controlled it and brought into the service of the people. For the first time, he says, the people should be able to specify exactly what they want from science. They know what science can provide, or it can be made clear to them what science can provide, and they can specify exactly what they want from science and technology, and seize control over it from those who are using it. And he uses the same notion that as it is, science is oppressive and alienating, it needs to be wrenched back from controllers and brought into the service of the people. And as the project in Chile continued on its way, he believed that those involved were getting more of an understanding of the cybernetics of government, and he wanted to make that available to the people. And there was this statement, 5 principles for the people towards good government, a simple statement of cybernetics, which he felt the people could grasp. Bogdanov similarly went out of his way to try to make his ideas available to people, to the proletariat. And his books were always written in a way that that he felt that the workers could understand. And he had classes. He had classes for workers as well. So the importance of science in society was really important, was significant for both of them, but they felt it was being misused in the current state, and they wanted to put science in the service of the people so that the people themselves took control and became world builders. And I'm using the terms of Bogdanov and Beer interchangeably there, because the two concepts, the two ideas that I'm exploring, match so closely on to one another. There's a comparison, of course, as well in the organizational models that they employed. They both wanted to break from mechanistic thinking and to develop an organizational view of the world. And both made full use of analogies for that purpose, particularly perhaps biological analogies. For Bogdanov, he talked about how incredibly organized cells were and other biological elements, and how we could learn so much from them. He talked about how society might be organized in the same way that the body was organized. Stafford, of course, his first account of the viable system model was premised upon the analogy between neurophysiological model of the brain and the nervous system and what the firm would look like if it was organized in that manner, both obeying the same cybernetic principle. And this is very much another example of pragmatism, that you don't necessarily have to start from scratch if you're looking for a model of a viable system. You don't have to build it from scratch, as a scientist might seek to do. You can use and take an analogy from somewhere else and see if it works. And both Bogdanov and Beer were very much good at this. And Stafford, of course, was remarkable in this, because not only did we have the initial neurophysiology firm analogy. Later on, there was also taking the concept of the icosahedron and using that to develop team integrity. So the two organizational models which were at the forefront of their work, technology for Bogdanov was the universal science of organization, and he believed that the universe was an endless flow of organized activity, from the most basic physical elements up through cells and animals and humans to the human collective, and that there was so much learning that you could take from organization at other levels in understanding the human collective and how that might be better organized. So his universal science of organization was meant to make the proletariat world builders, give them that capacity, and they were learning about organizational features of the world which could help in that particular process. And you get this notion of a hierarchy of forms of organization as well in Bogdanov. The basic element for Bogdanov was the complex. That's the basis organized element. We call it the complex. And it consisted of elements. But if you took a narrower view, then you could see that those elements were complexes as well, formed through conjunction of other elements. And there were, if you could form a successful conjunction, then a complex could become more differentiated and complex. But there are always tensions as well in enabling a complex to survive. So the practical payoff for Bogdanov from technology was this understanding of how better to organize things for the human collective. And that was about forging what he called a dynamic equilibrium of a complex with its environment. And that happened through selection, where the environment would require certain things of the complex, not that the complex could also influence its environment in ways which would be beneficial to it. There were degrees of plasticity, he called it, that the complex could adopt depending upon the nature of its environment. So, for example, in a turbulent, uncertain environment, then it needed to adopt a certain form of organization, the complex, if it was going to survive in its environment. In a more open environment, then a different form would be appropriate. A different level of plasticity would be open to it. And he was concerned with what could destroy a complex, what could enable it to survive, and how it might fail and be destroyed. And he wanted regulators there to enable the complex to survive. And he has this notion of the bi-regulator, which is negative feedback, which anticipated, of course, Wiener's work. And perhaps his most best known principle for the survival of a complex was the law of what he called the law of the leasts, whereby you had to develop the whole complex in equilibrium. And if any part of it was failing, any functional element in it was failing, the least, as he would say, then you had to look after that, such that the whole could function appropriately. Nothing should lag behind. None of the functions should be neglected. Now, you'll already, of course, in this grouping, be seeing very, very close comparison with Stafford Beer's viable system model, cybernetics as the science of effective organization. We have there what Stafford regarded as a perfectly generalizable model when we're talking about organized entities, just as for Bogdanov. There's a considerable amount, as we know, it's based upon the notion of how an organization can adapt to maintain viability in its environment by balancing varieties, handling the variety of balance with its environment at the same time as maintaining a variety of balance between a controller or a management and the operations of the entity. The concept of recursion is much better worked out in, although it's present in Bogdanov, in essence, it's much better worked out in the viable system model, but they both have that same concept. And of course, for Beer, the practical payoff of the viable system model is that it enables us to have a science of organization such that we can better organize an entity that we want to bring into existence, or one that's already in existence that we want to improve. And if we're diagnosing, we can pick out pathologies, such as, for example, whether the system 1 elements have sufficient autonomy to being able to manage their bits of the environment, the bits of the environment relevant to them, or the balance between system 4 taking the organization forward in terms of what the environment requires, and system 3, which is looking to improve internal efficiency and efficacy. So really significant comparison, I think, between the models, the model that Bogdanov puts forward in technology and the viable system model. The concepts are very, very similar. Anybody want to come in? Okay, I'm getting away with a lot here, but the argument's going on. Visions of a better society. Bogdanov wrote two science fiction novels. Red Star came out first, and that's a sort of utopian communist society, a description of a utopian communist society that out on Mars, and it's anybody's not seen it, it's read it, it's quite a remarkable read. The second one was called Engineer Many, and that predates Red Star. It describes the development of technology as a science fiction novel on Mars prior to the revolution, which brings about this utopian communist society organized according to technological principles on Mars. Much of Stafford's discussion of the kind of society he'd like to see, I think you can find in Designing Freedom. So let me talk a bit about these two conceptions of a better society. For Bogdanov, it was a planned economy, organized according to the principles of technology. And the economy was there to serve the purposes of the population as a whole. And he was concerned too that the various elements of the economy, the various firms, if you like, were related interdependently, and he wanted to make sure that occurred in a kind of causal chain, linked together, so that each was providing the needs of others. If you were a steel plant and you needed the raw materials, other firms would supply what it was that you needed, and the economy could be planned that way. Although how each particular firm achieved its goals was left up to that, for Bogdanov, was up to that organization itself. It's a general kind of planning with a lot of autonomy at the level of individual enterprises. So you'd have some kind of plan for the whole economy with the various parts of it expected to achieve certain things. and through feedback, you'd find out whether the economy was in fact achieving those things. And if it was achieving more than was required by the plan, then that surplus would be put towards investment and to the development of a more consumer goods to satisfy the population. In Red Star, you see more of this kind of society explained in detail, and it's a Central Bureau of Statistics, a Central Institute of Statistics, as Bogdanov called it. A Central Institute of Statistics was responsible for the planning. So if one entity in the plan wasn't realizing its particular goal, then effort could be shifted. The workers would shift over to move into that particular firm or enterprise in order to bring it back closer to the plan. And because in Red Star, everybody had everything that they needed, there was access to sufficient consumer goods to lead a good life, that everyone was provided with their basic needs. They would do this on the basis of comradely cooperation. And there was no, it's very much a society free from any sort of hierarchy or authority relationships, no class relationships, no gender relationships of oppression. A nice description of a well-organized cyber-communist, if you like, society, with information flows going into the Central Institute of Statistics and the society being organized on that basis. Now, Bogdanov, of course, never had the opportunity. By the time of the revolution, he was sidelined, or he continued to be very active. So he never had the opportunity to put his ideas into practice. But following 1917, nobody knew what the hell to do with the Soviet economy that had been nationalized and was owned by the state. And so his ideas did come into play and were taken up by figures who were still influential politically, such as Bukharin, who argued for society being organized according to this dynamic equilibrium, obeying the law of the least, and with attention paid to the weakest parts of the economy. Now that became that had an influence over Soviet central planning for quite a number of years under Lenin, even though he'd fallen out with Lenin, until Stalin took over. And this is what Stalin said, and this was a direct, if you like, rebuke to Bukharin and to Bogdanov. He said that, you know, of course, that the so-called theory of equilibrium between the sectors of our national economy is still current among communists, awful people like Bukharin. This theory, of course, said Stalin, has nothing in common with Marxism. And he went on to decide to industrialize the society as rapidly as possible without, at the expense, if you like, of the peasantry. Bogdanov and the theory of equilibrium would never have allowed that, because you'd have had to look after, according to the law of the least, the peasantry at the same time as you were seeking to achieve rapid industrialization. So Lenin sidelined Bogdanov, and then Stalin completely wrote him out of history. And anybody who had ideas similar to Bogdanov's became, their allegiance to Bogdanov's ideas was used against them, as in the case of Bukharin. There was another brief flowering of these ideas under Khrushchev and Kosygin in the 60s in the Soviet Union with Soviet cybernetics. And this is talked about in a book by Gelovich and also in a novel by Stafford. And they're, in a sense, asking what might have happened if these ideas had indeed been taken up again in the form of Soviet cybernetics. And it was a very interesting period, as you can read about in those books. But unfortunately, the power of the party, if you like, the party was unwilling to give up, control and Soviet cybernetics, as far as it continued to exist, was used as a mechanism of reinforcing that control rather than giving it up, as it were. Designing freedom, very attractive, of course, because it offers this, what Stafford calls a liberty machine, the notion that society can operate in a way that gives maximum autonomy to its parts, ultimately to the people, so they can fulfill their eudaimonia, maximum autonomy to the parts, at the same time as maintaining overall cohesion. And the Chilean economy was organized, if we turn specifically to the economy, it was organized in a manner, a recursive manner, whereby each level was due to be provided with the tools to develop itself, to make use of its own autonomy. And of course, information technology, again, was crucial. The CyberSyn project had its cybernet element, whereby information was due to be distributed to the firms so that they could adjust according to what was happening in it and their concept of their environments to improve their performance. Cyberstride, picking up significant changes in, for example, production that might take a firm away from its plan. The Checo simulations based on system dynamics, which would ultimately have allowed each level or sector in the economy to plan for itself with a better understanding of what's happening in its environment, and the ops room where all these things were brought together. So, I mean, Bogdanov did talk about the way that he'd have organized the Soviet economy, and I said a little bit about that. His ideas did have an impact immediately because there was no other way of doing it post 1917, ultimately suppressed, but the full account in Red Star of a sort of cyber communist utopia. Stafford did have a chance to put the ideas into practice. We can read a lot about how far that particular experiment went. I would suggest that it's very close to the kind of thing that Bogdanov was seeking to do, but given the different historical periods, obviously not exactly the same, but the aims and the intentions, given the similarities in philosophy and the view of science was similar. And whereas Bogdanov was suppressed by Lenin and then Stalin, the CyberSyn project, of course, came to an end with the Pinochet coup d'etat. So neither had chance to fully develop. The importance of cultural development. Let me speed up a little bit given the time. Both believed that a cultural revolution was an important part of a societal revolution as a whole. Bogdanov was central in the 1905 revolution in Russia, and well, to cut the story short, I think he learned a lot from that, in that he felt, because of the failure of that revolution, that the proletariat wasn't yet equipped organizationally and culturally to take the leading role in society. And that's why he was quite skeptical about the 1917 revolution. But he didn't stand back and moan. He continued his work in attempting to develop a proletarian culture, particularly through the Politkult movement, which was seen at the time as a sort of third wing of the revolution, alongside the political revolution and the economic revolution. Between the politics and the trade unions, there needed to be this cultural revolution led to Politkult. So the development of a proletarian culture, they wanted to produce a workers' encyclopedia, they wanted to form a workers' university. And it was a really significant movement, very suspicious. Lenin was very suspicious of it. Some very influential figures in there. The constructivist art movement was in there. Eisenstein was a member, the film director was a member of the Politkult. So, and as I mentioned in Red Star, the notion that of comradely cooperation, that the need for a change in thinking, so that people were more cooperative, was crucial to Bogdanov. In Chile, you get Project Cyberfolk, developed by Stafford. Particular element of this was the algedonic signals, which he said were the first attempt to produce a metric for eudaimony in Aristotle's sense, so that when decisions were being taken in the operations room, people could, through electronic devices, signal whether they felt it was indeed something that they were in favor of, that would help them in their lives to realize their potential more. Other aspects of it were getting artists and poets to translate the ideas for the people. There was the famous song by Angel Parra. And later in the Cybersyn project, Beer recognized even more the importance of a cultural change, and the notion of a people would have had an extra level of recursion, because you'd have had the society as a whole and the people project, commerce project, and also the running of the economy. So both very much in favor of a cultural revolution alongside the political and economic revolutions that were taking place. And after this bit, I am going to stop just for a while before I come back again to a short account of those who've sought to take these ideas, which offer, I think, intimations of a post-capitalist society, Bogdanov's work and Stafford's work, before I come on briefly to describe the work of some who have taken the ideas forward. But here's another point, I think, which is significant, that the criticisms of what Bogdanov was saying and the criticisms of what Stafford was saying are both very similar in orientation, are both very similar, which again tends to suggest to me that they have a lot of things in common in what they were suggesting. If people criticize them for the same things, then maybe they've got, maybe we're right in saying that the similarities in their work are substantial. So the notion that the work is overly schematic is an important critique. Lenin said that technology was organizational gibberish. It was unspeakable nonsense, sterile, lifeless, and scholastic. In other words, he didn't really like it. And even Bukharin, who was sympathetic to Bogdanov, regarded it in his funeral speech, mentioned that it was abstract schematization, and condemned an acolyte of Bogdanov in these terms. Just because a table has 4 legs and a cow has 4 legs doesn't mean that you can understand them in the same way. And the first translator, the first review of the German edition of Techtology, again refers to its schematism, the notion that it doesn't say enough about the differences between the different system types. You do get similar kinds of criticism coming to the fore in terms of Stafford's work in Chile, when we have Flores saying that the problem was, his problem was persuading others, and that the model was a little bit sidelined, if you like, in the sense that it didn't engage with the day-to-day political process and the problems that were going on. Medina summarizes that critique, if you like, this way. She says that perhaps the most important shortcoming of the project and why it was not adopted more broadly was it did not connect to the political, economic, and social processes that consume the country. Such problems as runaway inflation, lack of foreign credit, falling copper prices, and the black market hoarding. The system also did not connect to the changes that were taking place on the factory floor. So overly schematic, I guess, that critique of the Chile project, just as Bogdanov was criticized for being over schematic with technology. The notion that both were technocratic and were liable to potential authoritarian interpretation comes across in criticisms of both. At the time when Stalin was being denounced, people wanted to somehow keep allegiance to Lenin. He was still the savior, the person who founded the Soviet state. They wanted to keep allegiance to Lenin and to condemn Stalin. And people began to blame Bogdanov. I mean, this was nonsense historically, but they began to blame Bogdanov and his sort of technocratic vision of a cyber-communist society, if you like, for the overly centralized, over-bureaucratic Soviet reality. And to say that he was responsible for the kitchen, the horrible thing that actually the Soviet society had become under Stalin. Under Beer's, of course, when he was working in Chile, the Observer ran an article saying Chile run by computer. The New Scientist wondered whether the model being used was increasing the power of technocrats. And even the sympathetic journal Science for People ran an article saying Chile, everything under control. And Medina, in looking at this potential criticism, says that she's undecided about whether, in fact, the project might have ended with more power for technocrats, whether the more powerful people, had it been allowed to continue, had it been enabled to continue. And of course, it's very, very easy to say that these criticisms missed the mark because this is not in any sense the way that the model was supposed to be used. Bogdanov didn't want his technology to be used that way. Stafford said he didn't want his viable system model to be used that way. But you have to be careful and ask the question whether models that apparently can give you a way of engineering society do have an authoritarian interpretation. And we have the example of the Nazis using Bertalanffy's thinking, the organic vision of society that he produced, as being a way of justifying National Socialism there. So in all these areas, I would argue, the comparison, I think, much more closely between Bogdanov and Beer than between Bogdanov and von Bertalanffy. And those notions, as I say, similarities in philosophy, the way they saw science as being central to building a new kind of society, their organizational models, the belief in the importance of the cultural development and the cultural revolution, and as well, the similarity in the criticisms of the two point to me to two thinkers whose work had a great deal in common and a great deal as to offer, I shall be going on to say, to those who are interested in building a post-capitalist society. So I'll pause there, if I may, Angela, for questions and discussion.
Great. Excellent. Yes. Please, we have one comment from Robin.
Hi. I really think that those criticisms have got completely the wrong stick, as it were. Because I think I don't know Bogdanov's work, but I do know Stafford's work very well. And what Stafford did was to open the door to process thinking in a much better way than Alfred North Whitehead did. And it's certainly constructivist. And I think that if you start to think in process terms, what you're doing is aligning yourself with, what can I say, sustainable peoples, the peoples who occupy the Amazon, the Aboriginals of Australia. They are the people who think the way Stafford was thinking, not technology. So it's a completely wrong, it's a completely wrong end of the stick kind of criticism to criticize him for going technocrat when in fact he's gone completely the other way.
Well, of course, I'm not criticizing him for that. I'm pointing out the criticisms that were made.
I understand.
The only thing I would say, I've thought a little bit about that as well, Robin. The only thing I would say is that it's absolutely clear to me in Bogdanov's work that it is the proletariat, as was called that obviously in Marxism, is the proletariat that itself uses the tools. He was absolutely clear that technology would enable them, would put science in their hands so that they could become world builders and build the kind of society that they wanted. I think that the Project Cybersyn was heading in the same that direction. Of course, that each element within the system was being provided with the tools that would enable it to have the autonomy to develop in its own way. But it's not quite as clear to me that the science is being, if you like, wholly handed over in the way that Stafford describes it, as it is in Bogdanov. That's all I'd say.
Yeah, the problem for me is that, of course, in the Western world, we don't think in the right way. We don't think in process terms. We think in object terms, and that's where most of the criticism comes from. And I think a lot of people don't really see that. I'd make two other comments. I think one, if you look at Thomas Piketty's Capital and Ideology, he points out that the way we run our society is, in a sense, just as extreme by idealizing private property as the Soviets did in idealizing state property, as it were. So you couldn't have any private property. So a real society has to, or at least a viable society has to go somewhere between those two. And there's lots of writing about the original Soviet Union. There's a book by Krista Goff, which talks about nested nationalism. So a lot of the ideas which were swinging around in the early days of the Soviet Union were very, if you like, cybernetic, let's say.
Well, I think I've said that.
Yeah.
Okay, we thank you, Robin. And we have another comment from James Fox.
Hi, Mike. Thanks. It's been really, really fascinating. I was just wondering, you mentioned people blaming Bogdanov for Stalin's crimes, as it were, which seems like a bizarre link to make. But I was just wondering sort of who had done that, or where I could read about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I got it from. I'll give it. This is what this is what they said. This is somebody called Arapov, and I'll tell you where to get it, where to find it. He says it was not Bogdanov who constructed this devil's kitchen, but he was one of its architects. So as you say, they're trying to blame Bogdanov for setting up the sort of centralized Gosplan that Stalin put in place, rather than Lenin. It's from it. If I think Angela said she can make the paper available where I discuss this stuff in more length. It's in a book.
Don't worry if it's if it's in the paper, I can look there. But that's helpful.
It's Bigot, Glavelli, and Yasser Bogdanov and his work, 2018. It's a Routledge book, but the full reference is in the paper.
So was that from was that a recent criticism? Was that like a recent criticism from a contemporary?
No. That was at the time when Stalin was being denounced by Khrushchev. You know, the crimes of Stalin were being denounced by Khrushchev. Yet they weren't willing at that stage to criticize Lenin in any way. So they had to blame somebody else for Stalin. And they decided that Bogdanov could be stitched up and to fit the bill, if you like.
Thank you. That's fascinating.
Thank you, James. We have Orson Senalp wanting to comment.
Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Mike. It's a great, fascinating conversation. I might answer. I might have some sort of answer to James' remark. First of all, I wanted to say that this year is the 105th anniversary of Bogdanov's birth. So this talk by Mike marks that also in a way. About the process thinking, I very much agree with Robin's contribution remarks that Bogdanov's understanding of organization is all about processes, activities, and resistances between elements. And this whole process goes through, it's very much like a Whitehead and Beer indeed. I wanted to say Dominique Lecourt, the student of Althusser, was raising this criticism of Bogdanov being the responsible from the Stalinist technocracy. It is a very much, it might have a source in Russia, like Mike, you said, after Stalin, and about that criticism. There was Ilyankov, very influential philosopher, Russian philosopher, critical of Bogdanov in that line, defending Lenin. But very interesting. I mean, very interesting, because the person after Bogdanov, who very close friend of Bogdanov, Bazarov, was active. He was in an active role in Gosplan. So he was implementing Bogdanov's ideas, trying to implement, but he got charged by Stalin by wrecking the economy, especially about this love of the least idea. That charge and accusation was about that. But I'm sure the Althusser highlighting together with Lecourt that kind of criticism in the Western world. So that was what I wanted to add.
Thanks, Orson. I'd also let me just say that I agree with this the process view. I didn't come back to Robin on that, but I agree absolutely with it. I'm just phrased it in terms of pragmatism, which is a form of process philosophy, of course. And I think that's where Bogdanov got a lot of it from Ernst Mach.
So thank you, Orson. And yes, Raul, please.
Mike, question. The law of the least, do you connect it to some, in some way or another, to recursion? Have you thought about the connections between that law of Bogdanov and the recursive structures?
I'd be interested in your views on that. I've thought about where the law of the least comes in. Might relate to the viable system model, for example. Well, the viable system model, and what I came up with simply a neglect of one of the 5 functional elements, if you like. In other words, if system 2 is not working well, then more attention needs to be given to that, and so on around the functional elements. So that I hadn't thought deeply about it, but that was my initial thought when it came to mind.
Okay, I think there is plenty to develop around that. The whole notion of complexity and the ideas of variety that are so well developed in Stafford's work, and that I am not aware of how they were developed in Bogdanov's. I just wanted to mention that cyberfolk was very, very strongly connecting people to policymakers. And in that sense, the idea of the ideas of technology and recursion are very much inbuilt in the whole idea of cyberfolk. So what at the end of the day, that part of the Chilean project was about was connecting the decisions of the people to the views of the decisions of the policymakers to the views of the people through attenuation and amplification of variety, which in a way, again, that connects to my views or perhaps my questions about the law of the least, because the least is what is going on with the people, with the whole basis of society. And the next thing that comes is how is it that these lists are somehow integrated and connected to those who are taking decisions and making policy making in society. So is that connection that I would be very keen, very interested to understand better in Bogdanov, because clearly I have very clear, and I was involved in all the aspects of cyberfolk, that it would be very, very interesting to see how is it that connects to the law of the least.
Yeah, Bogdanov was working with notions of dynamic equilibrium and how you could maintain an equilibrium. Obviously didn't have the concept of variety available to him. And as I mentioned, I don't think that the concept of recursion was as well worked out in Bogdanov. But the law of the least it is, I think, was historically significant, and I agree. It's worth looking more closely at how it would work in the context of recursion and the viable system model.
And the law, the cyberfolk was not another recursion within cyberscene. It was just another project in the Chilean process.
No, I understand. I do understand that. Yeah.
But it wasn't intended to be another recursion within. And in that sense, cyberfolk was trying to support the people with the changes in management of complexity, coordination, as you were saying, and on the whole, it was something that, as technology evolved, the connections, perhaps that's something that you are planning to talk about as technology evolved. Clearly, the people connection with the policymakers became very, very different. Mm-hmm. It wasn't what we had as an experience in Chile. Mm-hmm. So, and in that sense, is that I have more difficulties in seeing the connection of Bogdanov with Beer. Mm-hmm.
Well, Bogdanov had the Cultural Revolution alongside the revolution in economics and ownership, if you like, and Cyberfolk was running alongside, as you said, Raoul. I just have this memory, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that towards the end of the description in Brain of the Firm, there's somewhere a diagram whereby the whole of Chilean society is there, and another level of recursion is introduced, with the economy just which Cybersyn was, if you like, managing, was alongside the People Project, an extension of Cyberfolk in my mind, because it's a while since I've read it, and commerce, I guess because commerce had been proven important because of the strikes of the gremios. But that's my memory of that. The end of that book.
I think it would be very helpful to see your thoughts about the future of what is that all the views of these two people can help us to see the evolutions that we are in the post-capitalist society. So I prefer not to comment too much about that because it's the last bit that you are planning to propose.
I wish I had something to propose. I'm going to say a little bit about those people who have made use of the ideas to some extent. I wish I was able to propose something personally that I thought would work.
Right. Anyways, I think I'm going to stop here now, Angela.
Okay, thank you, Raul. We have one comment from Jose Perez Rios, and I also would like to make a comment. Jose.
Well, it's a pleasure to again with you because I was traveling in a car, so I don't know if my communication is good enough. But I have 2 questions to Mike to this very interesting presentation about Bogdanov. That we thank him for discovering some years ago for discovering this person. And the first question is the following. Mike, what do you consider that can be the of ideas what Beer has already developed? The question will be, how can we summarize what new components can be added to organizational cybernetics thanks to the contributions of Bogdanov? This would be one. And the other is more simple. You mentioned the 2 works, Red Star and the Engineer Money. I read the first. I did not read the second. What are the components, the essential components of each of them in relation to the thinking of Bogdanov?
If I were to answer those questions, we would have no time left. But just one thing about what Bogdanov can add potentially. This comes from Slava Maracha. And there's been a lot of talk about a 3rd order cybernetics, which looks more to cybernetics in the social domain. And he says that connecting Bogdanov's and Beer's ideas on organization, viability and national economic planning, the aim would be to develop a 3rd order cybernetics that could address the social and humanitarian issues faced in polysubject, socioeconomic, and socio-cultural systems. So those who think that second-order cybernetics perhaps ignores the social too much would see in Bogdanov's work a way of complementing existing cybernetics. And now I've forgotten the second question.
No, the second question, it was a kind of summary of the two. Engineer Money.
Engineer Many, what leads up to the revolution on Mars, which essentially the discovery of technology, how that came about. It's a huge time period on Mars whereby the revolution takes place. I mean, this was Bogdanov had come to this conclusion after the failure in 1905. Things were going to take longer. Red Star is the established utopian communist society.
Okay, thanks very much, Mike.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Jose. So, Mike, I do have a question, but I'm aware that you need to finish on time. So, White, if you want to finish your presentation and your proposal, I'll hold my question for the last moment if we have time. Yep.
Okay, thanks, Angela. So I won't take too long because, as I say, I have no obviously a solution to these issues. I just want to point people to where to look well, let's get on with it. Start with Bogdanov. Of course, we were all, those of us who were fascinated by Bogdanov were absolutely delighted when Carlo Rovelli, a famous physicist, took up Bogdanov's ideas and said how influential Bogdanov's ideas were becoming in his own thinking. And for those of you who don't know, Rovelli's book Helgoland is dedicated to Heisenberg, who founded quantum mechanics, and Bogdanov. So that's worth looking at. And the basis of Rovelli's, the reason Rovelli sees Bogdanov as so important is this. Bogdanov basically said that the individual is a bourgeois fetish. Now, what Rovelli says is that we'll get much further if we see individuals as being constructed through relations. So Rovelli says relations make up our I. We're subject to all the relations around us, and we respond to those relations. You can begin to see the link with quantum mechanics, perhaps. And that just makes Rovelli go off onto how much more important, in his view, collaboration has been in developing the best things about society than competition. So worth having a look at, I think. Mason's work, his book, The Post-Capitalism, he used to be a regular commentator on Newsnight elsewhere. Now he's off just writing different books on different themes. Post-Capitalism is the one where he spends most time discussing Bogdanov's work. Basically, he talks about the kind of thing that Raoul was hinting at, whether in fact nowadays with technology having developed the way it has, with the potential of the internet as we've seen, whether there are ways of, it was always a problem in centralized economies, that of information flowing quickly enough to match the efficiency of the market. So Mason is suggesting that we're now at a stage where we can actually transmit information around society about what the consumer wants and what is being produced, etc., in such a speedy manner that there is the potential to replace the market in a way that wasn't there before. He also, and it's a remarkable thing about Bogdanov, that he anticipated climate change, and Mason praises him for that. Walk, in her book, Molecular Red, very much goes into more detail perhaps than, well, it does go into more detail than Ravelli and Mason. And she sees us having arrived at a world historical moment of climate change and wants to re-establish this notion of the people as world builders, as needing to take responsibility. Try and find the exact words that are used, which I can't, of course, a Labour point of view in an age of climate change. We're at a world historical moment, and takes up the theme of a cyber communist society, linking in Bogdanov's work to various modern theories, particularly feminist theories. And Kim Stanley Robinson, if you haven't read the Mars trilogy, then set it as one of your bucket shop tasks. It's a huge trilogy. I read it on Kindle, so I'm not entirely sure how many words, how many pages it was, but certainly 2,000 pages, I think, divided into 3. And it tells about the colonization of Mars, and clearly inspired a little bit by Red Star. And there's a fictional descendant of Bogdanov called Arkady Bogdanov. Bogdanov himself was Alexander. Well, one of his descendants, Arkady Bogdanov, has a huge role to play in the way that they discuss politics and the organization of society on Mars. And there are 2 or 3 revolutions on Mars, and you eventually end up with a society on Mars in the Mars trilogy, which corresponds to something like Bogdanov's Red Star. So 200 years following first colonization, things are peaceful and egalitarian. No patriarchy, and the essential of life are freely available to all. Mars is even willing and able to extend the hand of friendship to Earth to assist with its many problems, especially overpopulation. So how did they arrive at that? Very much a sort of pragmatist, Bogdanovist way of proceeding. This is directly from Kim Stanley Robinson. He says, thus people hypothesized a system of governance, lived under it, examined how they felt about it, then changed the system and tried again. Certain constants or principles seem to have emerged over centuries as they ran through their experience and paradigms, trying closer approximations of systems that promoted qualities like physical welfare, individual freedom, equality, stewardship of the land, guided markets, rule of law, compassion to all. So you've got 2,000 pages of the development of Marxist of society on Mars in the direction that Red Mars ultimately describes. You spend a lot of your time traveling over the Martian landscape in space buggies, it has to be said, and it's such an intense read that you'll be dreaming about traveling over Mars, the Mars landscape, and the various aspects of the Mars landscape, which are described in absolute detail. You come away with an understanding of the topography of Mars and geology of Mars that you probably didn't want if you're only interested in Bogdanov. And I ended up, after having reading the trilogy, by buying one of these globes of Mars that revolves according to the Earth's magnetic field, so I could study the topography of it. It's a great trilogy. Stafford's work, let me come to go through quickly because many of you will be familiar with this, and I do want to give Angela a chance to ask a question. It's been recognized as important for communes, how they can work without breaking up and descending into chaos. John Walker, of course, has done considerable work applying it to workers' cooperatives. And I could quote you from Angela and John's book. A cooperative provides the perfect environment to apply the principles described in their book. Suma, the cooperative in which John worked, survived its crises, restructured, avoided command and control, and created a structure which enabled it to compete successfully and to create a more rewarding working environment. Departmental autonomy has ensured that every part of Suma has found the most environmentally appropriate way to go about its business. And there's a description of that process in Angela and John's book. And more recently, a book by Thomas Swan on anarchist cybernetics, where he brings close comparisons between the viable system model and the work of people like Kropotkin on mutual aid and the other anarchist, I've forgotten the name, Proudhon. And the reasons for the comparison are emphasized in his book. Again, it's back to the fact that we can somehow maximize the autonomy available to the parts while maintaining systemic cohesion, and it can be democratically organized as long as System 5 is democratic in its origins. System 1 and System 5 don't point to any kind of structural hierarchy. They're simply functions that are identified as necessary. There's not necessarily one more important than the other. In fact, Beer is always emphasizing how 2 to 5 are supportive of the System 1 elements. And of course, they're not individuals located in these functions. Individuals can undertake all these functions as long as they are undertaken for the purposes of surviving the viable system model. And the notion of recursion, the concept of federation, is very strong in anarchist thought. And he goes on to compare the viable system model to what happened during Occupy and the Occupy rebellion. So anarchist cybernetics, and then a good read, but very many points in common, as Swan acknowledges, with John's work on aligning the viable system model to workers' cooperatives. I'll stop at that point, Angela, and I'll deprive Raoul of the actual solution, which of course I have in my head, but I'm not prepared to reveal at the moment.
I think the actual solution, Mike, is that Rovelli's emphasis on interactions is, for me, absolutely crucial.
Yeah,
and I would have loved to see more of your discussion around this notion of interactions, which go in both directions, in Bogdanov and Beer, from the bottom up, where you really find the notion of interaction as the basis for organizational development. And what is interesting in Rovelli is that he doesn't take a view of interactions as something that only happens socially. He takes it as a very important aspect of each of us working out and developing our views into the future.
Of course, he relates that to quantum mechanics, where things only come into existence when they come into relationship with other systems.
Absolutely. I think that in my view, of that book was absolutely central, and somehow would help to build up the connections with Bogdanov and Beer, in the sense that it is related to the way totalities are formed from interactions of the groups of people, cooperation, and all of that. So no more. I will not say any longer.
So Well, thank you, Raul. I would like to hear John's comments about this and about Mike's suggestions. John, are you there?
I'll have to come through. You'll have to.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yeah, fascinating talk, Mike, and really pleased to see this. And I'd read most of the books that you recommended at the end, and particularly the Mars trilogy is just really inspirational and really, really good. And like Raul, I'm really looking forward to the to what comes out of this, because we've kind of created a platform here. We're saying, okay, we've got all these clues about how to create a post-capitalist society. And there's the work I did at Suma, and there are lots of things that came out of that which need to be developed and taken forward. And I think there's a lot of people thinking in the same way, that the way that society is crumbling around us at the moment, I mean, we're desperately in need of new ideas and new approaches. And I think Stafford's work is going to be central to that. I think the reason that co-ops and the work that Andrew and I did in the eco-village in Ireland, both of those contexts had already decided that authority and chains of command and obedience and people doing what they're told and the whole Taylorist catastrophe was unacceptable to them personally. And therefore they were looking at ways of organizing which would move beyond that. And I think that in co-ops, we'd always kind of assumed that we were prepared to be a little less efficient because of that, because there was always this sort of nagging doubt that hierarchies were very effective. And of course, what Stafford says is exactly the opposite, that hierarchies are not an effective way of organizing, and you have to base organization around autonomous groups and then building up this beautiful dynamic, this interactive this interactive interplay between autonomy and cohesion, which is really central to the understanding of the model. So I think there's loads of ways to go forward to this, and I hope the conference that we're doing in June, which is around emancipation, which is clearly an element of post-capitalism, or certainly in my view, will be a very useful context to take some of these ideas forward.
Great.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Mike. I know that you have to go now, so I have to hold my question. I just wanted to comment about the relationship between Bogdanov and Beer, about putting doing science on behalf of the people. So, and the importance of technology being used for that purpose. But anyway, that opens another debate that, as Raul mentioned, we will need to explore further. So I think that there are many open questions, but absolutely fantastic conversation. And thank you very much for being with us. And really looking forward to find a way to continue this conversation. And thank you, Raul, as well, for your participation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everyone. Let's hope we can carry this forward.
That will be fantastic.
And let's hope Hull City win tonight against Burnley. I tell you, they won't. That's my prediction. So there we go.
Okay, I put a thing in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, that the law of the least sounds to me exactly the same as the idea that a viable system must be composed of smaller viable systems. And you go down through the recursions, so you get down to the least. And even at the lowest level, you have to have a viable system to compose the next level up, and then the next level and the next level. So it just sounds to me like it's saying that at all levels of recursion, all viable systems have to be viable. And doesn't matter how low you go in that, then, you know, you still need viability, which seems to be what the law of the least is saying.
Yeah, Raul made that point, and I hadn't thought of it. And I'm not sure, because I don't think Bogdanov thought in quite that way.
No, but he certainly saw it recursively from without really being too clear about it. But
yes, he did.
That's the way it will map onto it.
My own view would be that it maps more to the 5 systems 1 to 5, and the need for each of those to be given attention. But I mean, he was thinking of, but even that maybe not, because he was thinking of the different sectors of society. And as I say, the big argument was whether you could in fact be awful to the peasantry in order to be industrialized quicker. That's what the historical argument was about.
Yeah, indeed.
That's where the law of the least came in respect of that. Okay, I'm off. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.